Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another No Man's Sky video. Today we're going to take a quick journey back in time and see how this game has changed visually through the years. There are three major time frames when I believe No Man's Sky looked the most distinct, so the comparisons you will see today will mostly be between them. These were of course the old vanilla look, the Atlas Rises look, and finally the present time next. So let's dive right into this. Also, don't forget about our giveaway. There are 2 weeks left until the winner is picked, and if you haven't checked it out yet, you can follow the link down below to win any game you want. Of course, the giveaway wouldn't be possible without the awesome people over at Instant Gaming, which is a website where you can buy games really cheap. I'm going to leave a link down below you can use for some really awesome discounts, like for example No Man's Sky, which right now using that link is 55% off, probably the cheapest I've seen around. But anyway, back to our video. I've done these tests using the latest patches available for all of the versions at the maximum settings available and a resolution of 1440p. If you want to see my system specs, I've left them in the description box down below. But anyway, from the first glance we can see quite a big difference between the filters used through each major version. The old vanilla No Man's Sky used to have the vintage filter applied over it, which was a deliberate choice at the time, as Hello Games took great inspiration from the old sci-fi novels of the 70s and 80s. It's almost in direct contrast with Atlas Rises, for example, which opted for a more vibrant and bright look, as well as a much more diverse color palette and combination. Finally, we also have the next update, which went somewhere in between these two, while also putting a lot of emphasis on realism. But for next, it's no longer just the filters, but also the new graphical enhancements and the new assets, so the difference is rather huge between these. For the environment shots, I tried comparing relatively similar planets, as it's almost impossible to find the exact same models between such different versions of the game. Here, for example, we have a few shots where you can better see the style changing over time. The original version used to spawn very dense vegetation on lush planets with much taller grass and large forest areas, which gave it a more cozy and packed feeling that so many people loved. The color palette, on the other hand, was quite limited, which made vegetation look a little bit repetitive, especially when even the models themselves weren't too diverse either. Atlas Rises, on the other hand, fixed a little bit of this, with more varied grass size and orientation, as well as more color combinations. For example, in this shot, you can see this nice combination of blue, teal and green grass, and I really like this one. I don't think any other update since then has replicated that. This didn't mean that during Atlas Rises you couldn't find single color planets, but now Hello Games also added this possibility on top. Additionally, there was also a much greater tree variety, but another major drawback Atlas Rises had over the original was the fact that forests were no longer as dense as they used to be. So now, even on lush planets, trees were rather sparse and quite rare to find. Oftentimes you wouldn't even find forest areas or proper forest areas because of some strange technical bug in the background. With this in mind, the vanilla look and the Atlas Rises look were still not so far off from one another compared to what came next, and of course, pun intended, because next update brought in an even bigger change in both render style as well as the available colors. The new colors are much darker, less vibrant even compared to vanilla No Man's Sky, and oftentimes aim towards a more realistic feel. But with the Visions update, Hello Games addressed this in part, and they brought in more color combinations, especially for grass and vegetation, though it's still not anywhere near close to how it was during Atlas Rises, which is a damn shame because that was probably the best look outside of course of the tree problem. Moving on to the creatures, between vanilla and Atlas Rises, very subtle changes were made to them, which makes this comparison very hard to make. But I did notice a lot of similarities between similar species, though Atlas Rises most definitely had more spawns on lush planets compared to the vanilla No Man's Sky. Behavior and gameplay wise, creatures didn't bring much to the table, as their AI was quite basic and you couldn't really do anything with them. The biggest change of course came with the next update, when higher quality animations were added. Creature generation was vastly improved, including of course new models, as well as the AI improvements on top of that. For example, with the next update, creatures now display herd-like behaviors. They react to you in more ways than just running away from you. For example, they approach you if they see you feeding another animal, or otherwise they get scared if you pull your multi-tool at them. With that being said, there's still a ton of improvements that could be made by Hello Games. For clouds, you can see their drastic upgrade with the next update. Previous to that, they were just some 2D textures that had a drawback of breaking off on the horizon because of the limited render distance. The new and improved 3D ones that came with the next update come in multiple shapes and look much better. There's different ones depending on their altitude, there's even higher atmosphere clouds, their render distance is much higher, and they also cast shadows on the earth below. Water, on the other hand, remained unchanged outside of a few tweaks here and there, and it continues to be one of the most outdated aspects of this game. From vanilla to Alice Rises, there's virtually no difference outside of the foam, for example, that forms around the edges, with Alice Rises having a more pronounced and white foam for some reason, but the next update scaled back on that one while making water slightly more realistic, though not too much because it's still 2D water, and with such an outdated water rendering, it still looks odd in this day and age, so I hope this is going to be a main focus for Hello Games in whatever update they bring next. Of course, we can't talk about No Man's Sky and not go over the way the space is being rendered. Because of its original vintage filter, No Man's Sky Vanilla used to be darker even when spawning colors like orange and blue, but since Alice Rises removed the filter, this also made the backdrop brighter in many instances, which somewhat takes away from the whole experience. Like, you definitely don't feel in space as much as you used to in the vanilla game. It's something that continues with the next update as well, since it uses pretty much the same filter as before, and not much has changed since Alice Rises in terms of how the backdrop and the galaxies in the background are being rendered. With that in mind though, the way lighting affects planets and the planet detail has vastly improved over the years. Early versions of the game made planetary identification very hard, even when up close, and both because you couldn't scan and see what type of planet they were, and because their colors appeared more washed out because of its filter. With Alice Rises though, there was a big detail increase for planets when looking at them from outer space, and the new lighting also did a better job at revealing their details, so it was now easier than ever to identify what planet you were looking at. Next also further improved this and made islands, for example, and other smaller details show much better on faraway planets. It's still not perfect, but it's a definite improvement compared to how it was before. Now, speaking of planet rendering, back in the old days, it was quite common to see a planet fully covered in green from outer space, only to realize it was actually anything but that when landing on it. This was most prevalent both in the original No Man's Sky and also during Alice Rises, especially on lush planets because they had a lot of details on them, not just vegetation. With the next update though, this problem was drastically reduced, though some of it still lingers, so keep that in mind. I don't think there's a proper way to fully fix this, as the game is procedurally generating these as you go, so it's probably going to be very hard to actually render everything from very far away, but it's still a noticeable improvement, and I believe that is why we see this drastic change in the way the game looks, because it lets the game look better from afar, which is something that the game used to have huge problems with back in the days. Moving on to the ambient light, as I've said, this is probably what changed No Man's Sky the most, mostly from vanilla to Alice Rises. Originally, No Man's Sky didn't even have an ambient occlusion option, which made everything, including the characters, more bright as they would lack shading. That is why most people remember No Man's Sky 1.0 so fondly, is because it was made to appear more cartoony than it actually was. That feeling was further accentuated with the ships also having a black contour, which was most visible when in space and, you know, just checking a source of light, for example the sun, and eventually that was also removed, and by the time Alice Rises came by, the game already had horizon-based ambient occlusion, adding shading effects to everything from objects to characters as well, and Next did some improvements to that as well, but not that much. The biggest change and the biggest leap was from vanilla to Alice Rises. But moving on to models and textures, the most noticeable differences between 2016 and today can be seen with the spaceships. Between vanilla and Alice Rises, in terms of spaceships, not much changed, well, with the exception of some parts which were no longer static and a few of them were animated. The starter ship was also slightly changed from vanilla to Alice Rises with new wings, but Next brought a new level of detail with a ton more moving parts, new accessories, new gadgets, decals, and even tiny details like paint being scratched or damaged, along other stuff as well. Ground textures themselves also got an upgrade over time. Initially it was very low resolution during patch 1.0, but by the time Alice Rises dropped, it received a noticeable upgrade with a high resolution texture pack. It wasn't 4K or anything due to performance constraints, but some of the new textures looked great, like for example the new sand waves on desert planets. I believe those textures were some of the best. It was still not something, top notch, but it did a great job back then. By the time the next update dropped, details have increased even more, especially so when tessellation was added to make the ground truly 3D and not just a flat texture. And the ground nowadays has visible bumps on it, and it becomes even more noticeable if you set the options to ultra. There are other examples with rocks holding more detail, high resolution and better design. There's even cracks appearing in them, and with the Alice Rises and next update, they also introduced a few cool combinations of rocks and crystals, which I found really cool. The same can be said about the trees, but again, since this is all randomly generated, it's really hard to make a proper assessment. The difference between Next and Vanilla is the biggest though, with newer trees having more details and variations than how it was in 1.0. There are a ton of other changes too on top of this that I don't think I even have the time to cover in this video, like particle effects being drastically toned down as time went by, especially from mining and collecting minerals. Like back in the days when you mined a tree or a rock, you used to have a ton of stuff just spawning out of them and coming into your actual multi-tool. It was really spectacular in many ways. Outside of that, space stations have also become much more populated compared to the empty space buildings we used to have back in the days. It's definitely a noticeable improvement, and with the Beyond update, it's going to be even more improved than that, so I cannot wait to see how it is. Draw distance also improved from one version to another, from the blurry mass back in the old 1.0 version all the way to the crisp and well blended details in the next update. So there is a lot of other stuff on top of that, a lot more that I could have covered as I've said, but we simply don't have enough time. I do hope you enjoyed the video though. It definitely took a long time to film all of these, as it was required to have 3 separate game installations. So again, if you did, a thumbs up and a subscribe would be super appreciated, and I will see you guys next time, so peace out.